Writing an adventure for yourself or your friends can be very different than writing it for a much larger audience. And that's why we're talking to Chris Perkins, who arguably in the world is one of the best people to talk about writing an adventure that makes dungeon masters want to run it and players want to be in it.
I was inspired by the classic old TSR modules. They were kind of when I first picked them up and started to understand what a D&D adventure was, it was based largely on the deconstruction of those. So when the magazines came along and they started publishing D&D adventures in the short format, I had to adapt my style away from the 32-page module sort of structures to their much more condensed, in and out kind of approach to adventure presentation. I think my first bit of advice to anybody who ever decides to write an adventure for someone other than themselves is to analyze and deconstruct the adventures for that edition that have actually been published, whether they're long or short. Because I think you learn a lot more in the analysis of the adventures than you would just having somebody tell you what makes a good adventure, which is why I'm here to tell you what makes a good adventure. No. So I felt like I had lots of help in sort of honing my adventure style because I could just kind of imitate or copy the structure of some of my favorite modules. But I also received a lot of guidance from the editors of the magazines. They were instrumental in helping me understand what makes a good adventure, what separates a good adventure from one that's pretty much unpublishable. But before we get too far down this road, I think there are actually sort of two kinds of adventures in my mind. There's the adventure that you're just creating for yourself, in which case it doesn't matter really what it ends up looking like as long as it serves your needs. And then there's the adventure that you want other people to run, the adventure that you probably want to publish. And that's a whole different thing to think about. Because if you're just writing an adventure for yourself, you're probably sculpting it for your particular player characters. You're building something that you're hoping that is going to bait them into going off on the adventure that you've created, and you've thought about what are the motivations of the characters and what's going to drive them. If you're creating an adventure for other DMs to run, you don't know what party of characters are going to play through it. You don't know what the party composition is going to be or what their motivations are. So you are building something that is trying to take into account character motivation without knowing what it is, which means that it has to be, the bait has to be something kind of generally applicable. Like the reason for going on the adventure has to be something that maybe 80 or 90% of players are going to latch onto. And that's not always easy to come up with. Apart from those two separations, I think it's probably best not to talk about the home adventure that you just make yourself, which could literally just be a graph paper map with some notes that you wrote down. Or you might actually sit down and type it up like it's an actual adventure, but you're the one running it. Nobody else has to see your spelling mistakes or omissions or the sort of gross plot holes that you left in, or just the idiosyncratic nature of the work and your writing. And instead, I think it's probably more beneficial to anybody listening to this to talk about the adventure that is meant to leave your hands and be played by somebody else. And we've talked about this in the DMG and other places, but an adventure, even the most basic adventure, has fundamentally three things. It has the characters who are going to be going on the adventure and what motivates them. So you need the goal of the adventure. Why are they going on the quest? You need the place where the adventure happens, which might be a dungeon, it might be a ruin, it might be on board a ship, it might be in space, who knows. And then the third thing you need is, of course, the villains and their goals. Those are kind of the legs upon which adventures stand. Sometimes you can get away with not paying much mind or kind of being a little shallow on one. It could be a very simple location like a tavern. It could be not so much a villain, but like just a group of monsters that are hanging out in the location. Where you can't really give the short shrift is in the character's motivation. Case in point, let's take the simplest adventure of all time. There's gold in that thar dungeon. Go get it, be rich. The classic Monty Hall adventure where the character's only motivation is greed. They hear about a place that's full of treasure and they go there to get the treasure to become rich and more powerful. Unfortunately, in many cases, that is not going to inspire good adventure design, or even worse, there will be groups out there that don't want to play it because the simple motivation of greed does not appeal to their characters, and possibly not even to the players. So if the reason for going on the quest is an instant bounce off point, it doesn't matter how cool the rest of the adventure is. If they go on it at all, they're not going to be terribly interested in it. And so they're resisting you. The players are kind of resisting the adventure the whole way through. But you can do really simple things to a simple idea to make the adventure more appealing to a broader group of players. For instance, it could be that the gold in that dungeon was stolen from the town or the temple in the town that was guarding it, say. In which case, there is another reason aside from greed to go after the treasure, particularly if, say, there's a cleric in the party or a paladin in the party who wants to do the right thing. It's not just about greed, it's about getting gold back to the people who had it and who were protecting it. Another possible hook is there's gold in that thar dungeon, but there's an evil warlord over here that knows about it and wants to get the gold to fund his evil military campaign. Now suddenly you have a motivation of get the gold to keep it out of evil's hands. Just the simple addition of some deeper motivation that's sort of more universally appealing to a larger number of players is going to make the adventure much more successful and frankly much more memorable, because you've either tapped into something that the players care about as human beings, or you've tapped into something that speaks directly to certain characters of the party. I think where sometimes we fall down a rabbit hole as designers is trying to make a quest so appealing to all the players in the group. And often that's not necessary. You only need, if you've got a group of players who play well together, if you have one or two players who are interested in completing the quest, often the others are happy to come along for the ride and contrive their own reasons for going. So that's basically why I think that coming up with a good goal is the most important thing that the adventure needs. Good villains and fun locations are also nice to have. I mean, with Ravenloft, there's this weird situation where you're kind of dragged into the realm of Barovia. You don't voluntarily go there. And so there is a survival instinct that kicks in immediately when you realize you're kind of trapped and that the only way out is to deal with the vampire. You are kind of thrust into danger in that way. And that not having control over your fate is one way to go with adventure design. You can sort of just throw characters into a situation and say, deal with it. Like, there have been adventures published which have basically been framed as, your characters wake up in prison with none of your gear, or your characters wake up in a cave with none of your gear. What do you do? And then it becomes a mission of survival, finding equipment that will save your life, and that has merit as an adventure, and it's been done. The first time I ever saw it done was in an adventure called Module A4 in the Dungeons of the Slave Lords. It was the finale of a series of adventures designed as tournament play adventures, where after the characters are defeated by the villains in the third installment, in A4, they wake up in a dungeon, abandoned on an island that's going volcanic and about to explode. And they have to get out of the dungeon, get their gear, and get off the island before everything goes pear-shaped. And that can work. It's unusual. to just sort of in medias res, or just sort of drop characters in a predicament and then have them get out of it. But it can be rewarding. You just can't do it all the time. Or your players. The two biggest shortcoming, the only real shortcoming in an adventure, as far as the only thing that sets an adventure up for failure almost immediately, is the presumption that the characters have no control. An adventure always has to present characters with meaningful choices. And if every adventure starts where they have no say into how their characters got there, then the players are not going to like that over time. It's a novelty, but if you play that novelty card too often, it becomes tiresome and frankly annoying. Similarly, if you're going off on an adventure and everything that they encounter has to be solved in a certain way, or they just can't move forward, that also feels very unrealistic and unrewarding. If the only way to defeat the villain is to kill them, that's kind of boring and dull. And frankly, a lot of players will go to great lengths to prove the adventure wrong, when the adventure should have accounted for the possibility that there are other outcomes that are possible. And an adventure should not be broken if the characters make the wrong choice. And as when I was designing adventures early on, and I didn't know, I had none of these sort of nuanced understandings of what makes a good adventure, what makes a bad one, what's likely to work and what's likely not to work, what's going to be popular, what's not. I made all the mistakes of railroading the characters, having the villains do things that they couldn't do within the logic of the system just to keep them alive, or to contrive a way for them to accomplish a goal when it didn't make any sense, even if the players interfered with them. Always making sure the villains got away, not giving the characters a chance to try to stop them. It's very easy for somebody who's accustomed to reading novels to write an adventure like a novel. And you can't do that because A, you don't know who the protagonists are. That will change every time the adventure is run. And B, this is a game with dice rolls and random outcomes. You have to build the adventure with the possibility that your villain will get critical hit 4 times in a row and die before he even gets through a monologue or before he gets to make an attack. The adventure has to be able to withstand that kind of circumstance and not feel completely unrewarding. So there's a lot of this stuff isn't terribly important though, or not as important as things like just making sure you have good goals. I mean, D&D will always breed its own camp and its own humor. Players and DMs will bring humor to every adventure, whether the adventure intended it or not. So we often tell writers, and have in the past, that you don't have to go out of your way to be funny because the people around the table are going to bring that to funny. What you need to do is create situations in the adventure that could breed memorable, laughable moments. And I spend a great deal of time weighing the balance between serious and silly. If you look at the Monster Manual, it is a balance between serious and silly. There's a lot of silly stuff in there. That's becoming something of a hallmark with me. Even in Curse of Strahd, which could be completely depressing, there is humor and silliness. And that was actually present in the original Ravenloft as well, particularly the crypt names in the depths of the castle. They were ludicrous. And being able to just run with that and come up with even more ludicrous things was a lot of fun. I think it's important because adventures that are published aren't merely meant to be played, they are meant to be read. And if you're going to make somebody read something, for fuck's sakes, make it entertaining. And sometimes that means bringing a smile to the DM's face when they read it. Because the DM's thinking, oh, I can't wait till the players get here. They're gonna have a good time. I remember reading, I think it was Lost Tomb of Martek, module I-5, and there's one encounter where you come to this shaft and it's got portals at the top and portals at the bottom, so if you fall, you immediately teleport back up to the top and just keep falling eternally. And one of the things that I guess had fallen into this shaft was a mummy. And so you're just at the edge of the shaft and this mummy goes down, and then down again, down again. And there was a passage in the text that said, and woe be to he who is hit by a falling mummy. And doesn't say anything else. Like there are no rules for being hit by a fallen mummy or anything. And that just made me laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. There's also a book that you can find, I think in Martuck's tomb or library, which is Snow Dwarf and the Seven Whites, W-I-G-H-T.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, bad puns.
I love me a
Yeah,
white pun.
yeah. Put puns in your adventure. Put little laughs, little Easter eggs in your adventure. Things that you know that the DM will chuckle over, because if they come away from reading that adventure having had a few good laughs, they're much more inclined to run it. My favorite, even most serious adventures that I've read, my favorites have little gems of humor embedded in them, where you can tell that the writers were having some fun and it was a fun adventure to write. That makes it all more fun to read.
Thank you, Chris Perkins, for being on the show. D&D Beyond is the official digital tool set for 5th edition D&D. I'm Todd Kenrick. Thank you for watching.